Hey, down in front, huh?
When Luther arrived on the scene, the Holy Roman Empire was a complicated web of inseparable relationships between religious and secular institutions. In fact, whole histories have been written about the role the papacy played in worldly affairs, apparently apart from any spiritual duties. But it's essential to remember that the authority claimed by the papacy was rooted in the spiritual practices and oversight it claimed in the world. One fascinating area to explore, then, is how theological assumptions perpetuated the power and influence the Church had on daily life.
Are you gonna talk through the whole movie, or?
I'm sorry. This is the only time I have to teach this episode. They're kind of here, right now. Sorry about that. No more interruptions. To understand this better, one simply needs to look at what motivated the average person to participate in the system. You can find this in a set of questions.
How are humans put right with God? How do Christians know they're in good standing with God and therefore live in eternity?
In sum, this is what is known as the problem of justification in theological jargon. There were and still are a number of issues surrounding justification. Issue number one is the problem of sin. Christians will generally agree that sin makes us unrighteous, but over the course of Christian history, there have been a variety of definitions of sin. Late medieval theology understood sin in two ways, and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, the sins of omission and commission. Omission means failing to do something good, and commission means actively doing something forbidden.
I think he's talking to us.
The late medieval understanding of sin, and the understanding Luther was taught, was that there's a distinction between original sin and sins actually committed in life. This meant that sin was tangible and measurable, which naturally led to an accounting mentality when it came to sin. Christians in that time understood that sin throws off the relation between God and humans. Naturally, this led to the question of
how can the righteous God and the unrighteous human get together?
Somehow, the accounting records or scales must be balanced in order to make justice work. The goal for the individual Christian was to make the relationship with God righteous again. In other words, the question became,
how do you balance the scales between the righteous God and unrighteous, sinful human?
The medieval answer:
Cooperate. Cooperation with God will make you righteous.
Specifically, in medieval times, there were basically two models of cooperation with God. The Thomists, those who followed Thomas Aquinas, and the Occamists, or nominalists, those who followed William of Ockham.
Oh no, not now. We're doing something different this time.
Let's look at the Thomist understanding of cooperation first. This is a model or a theological theory called the Via Antiqua. In this way of understanding things, you begin with original sin, which is not your fault, but yours nevertheless. You are born with this original sin.
It's not my fault. I was born with sin.
Now that you know the sickness which you're born with, you need to know the antidote.
I have the antidote.
Well, the antidote, according to Thomas, was the infusion of grace, freely given by God. Next question: how do I get this free grace? Answer:
You initially receive it at baptism, and then later on in life you receive more with other sacraments.
Yes, it's these later infusions of grace that are the moments in which you cooperate with God. The sinner in this model has a moral obligation to cooperate with God toward his or her salvation. You do your best with the aid of grace. The outcome, or the goal of the Christian life, then, is that you earn the reward of eternal life.
And I can have this reward, even with my original sin, the sin I was born with.
We'll get into that a little bit more, but yes. There are a few important things to notice about the Thomist way of understanding the relationship between God and sinful human beings. First, the sacraments, the first step on a sinner's path, put you into a state of grace. This is God's special gift. It has nothing to do with human achievement.
So, in this system, to the Thomist understanding, nothing I do will get me this gift? Not even saving the world from nuclear war?
Grace, in this theological system, is understood as a type of energy, basically, and it's the foundation for your cooperation with God. In fact, an infusion of grace must precede every meritorious act. In other words, you need an infusion of grace delivered through a sacrament before every act of love or charity you perform in order for that act to move you closer to God. This is based on Aquinas' understanding that grace makes faith. But there remains a problem. The result of grace is only belief in facts. That kind of faith was not enough for salvation. Instead, Aquinas said that faith must be formed by acts of love in order to earn salvation. The Latin phrase for this understanding is fides caritate formata, which means faith formed by love.
Speaking of love, are you ever going to come and save me, Jackson?
Not now, Candace. This is just really fascinating. You should listen too.
This was and still is a pivotal understanding of the Christian life and the role of a Christian in his or her own salvation for those who follow Thomas Aquinas' theology. Faith, in and of itself, was not sufficient for salvation for Thomists. This Thomistic understanding makes the role of the sacraments essential. Sacraments are understood to be the primary vehicle and communication of grace. Baptism is thought to wash away the guilt of original sin. Penance, another of the 7 sacraments, helps the individual Christian fight against actual sins and balance the scales between God and the sinner. The result of this way of thinking? Medieval people were always on the way. They were on a journey toward salvation, toward God. At the same time, however, they were pilgrims, uncertain of their destination.
You know, I get that. I mean, I'm supposed to be over here going after Jackson and stuff, chasing after him, but never sure where it's all leading.
I don't feel like the trailer for the movie sold this.
On a side note, you may be thinking that this type of language sounds familiar.
I was just going to say that. I was raised Catholic, and this really sounds a lot like that.
Not only Roman Catholics, but also with the majority of Protestants, even some who call themselves Lutheran.
My Boompy and Nana were devout Lutherans.
But you said there were basically 2 theological models for how we cooperate with God in medieval times. What is this? What's the second model?
The second model was based on the theories of William of Ockham. Those who followed this model were called Occamists or nominalists. This way of thinking is also called the Via Moderna, as opposed to Thomas Aquinas' model, which was the
Via Antiqua!
Ockham offered a critique of the old way of thinking, specifically the Via Antiqua. He believed the problem with the Via Antiqua was that it preserves neither God's freedom nor human freedom.
Yeah, it sounds like the root of Occam's problem with Via Antiqua was the question of whether or not a human really loved God freely.
Yes, nominalists, those following Occam, had an optimistic anthropology. In other words, they believed that God's gifts of reason and conscience had not been removed by the fall. Further, biblical commands seem to say each person had the ability to take the initiative in salvation.
We must be able to do what God commands, and therefore we must be able to take the initiative in our own salvation.
The other major problem Ockham had with the Via Antiqua was the question of God's freedom. With respect to the Thomist model of cooperating with God, Ockham asked the question,
how can we keep from thinking God is somehow obligated to save humans?
His answer to these difficulties? A contract, a covenant between us and God. That contract looks like this. First, we humans must make a moral effort. We must do the best we can on the basis of our natural moral ability. Second, an infusion of grace serves as an appropriate reward.
So we cooperate with God, and we do the best we can morally with the aid of grace. Our reward for doing this is eternal life.
This reminds me of the Latin phrase, facere quod in se est. Do what is in you.
And God will not deny you grace.
Now, as is almost always the case with competing theologies and theories, the other side usually levels a critique as to why the competitor is wrong. Thomists accuse the Occamists of taking up the old heresy called Pelagianism, the notion that humans gain or earn salvation through the act of the will. Occamists responded to that criticism with a definitive no. It was not human activity which gained salvation. Rather, it was God's willingness to value that human activity that resulted in salvation. In other words, they asserted that God had set up this system and would stick to it. One important key in this way of understanding our relationship to God is that for the Occamists, people could initiate their own salvation. No matter which theological school a late medieval person subscribed to, fundamental to the enterprise was the role of the sacraments. With that said, one can then see how the authority claimed by the Pope in regard to the forgiveness of sins and the sacraments was undergirded by both the Via Antiqua and the Via Moderna.
I think your Bumpy and Nana were bad people.
That's low.
Facere quod in se est, and be dead.
I don't think that line was in the script.
Via Antiqua!